Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to my figure painting workshop. This is the first workshop series or tutorial series that I'm putting up on YouTube for free. So welcome everybody, welcome to my channel. This is sort of a new thing for me. It's a big test to see if I want to make these sort of videos in the future. But this is all recorded real time. So no edits, and so if there's any bugs and glitches, well, be forewarned. This sort of series is going to look at figure painting specifically in digital medium. So I'm using Photoshop CC. If you guys are using iPads or other programs like Coral Paint, I mean the techniques and the methods are applicable as well. Just some of the tools like the brushes and the interface and stuff might be a little different. So in this first part, we're going to look at some key principles that will be applied to the demos later, and some techniques. And I have a worksheet set up with some spheres that we can paint on to try out these techniques. And yeah, we're also going to look at the tools, the brushes and stuff that I use, and then cover some quick theories on value and color, so that once we hop into the more complex like drawings, we have the toolkit necessary to tackle all that stuff. Okay, well, so let's hop into it. Just actually a quick note before we get into all the things. Like this is this sort of tutorial series will get pretty advanced in the theories and techniques. So if you're like brand new to Photoshop or brand new to art in general, I suggest you do a little bit of studying beforehand to learn some principles of like gesture drawing and anatomy, and sort of have like a sort of base understanding of what figurative painting is, because yeah, this tutorial will sort of look at some more specific techniques, and I'll breeze over some of the fundamental theory, but like, you know, the main, like when we're looking at light, for instance, to know what like a key light is, or what the core shadow, what the reflected light is, like those sort of principles, I'll graze over quickly, but I think I suggest you guys develop a fundamental understanding of those principles, so that so that, you know, half the stuff doesn't just go right over your head. But you know, that said, I'll try to make this as accessible as possible, and because it's all live recorded, there's no, like, I mean, it's only gonna go as fast as I talk and as I can paint in real time. So there's not gonna be any like time lapse, or so stuff will go by pretty slowly. If you guys do choose to scroll through really fast, YouTube has this awesome feature where you can speed up the video. So yeah, if ever you get bored, or if ever, you know, there's long periods of silence or whatever, especially in the demo part, feel free to speed through or click through. I'll try to include sort of timestamps in the description, so that yeah, you guys can jump to the important chapters, I guess, of this workshop. So yeah, so let's hop into it. Part one. So let's start with a quick tool overview. So I'm using Photoshop CC, as I mentioned before. I'm also working on a Cintiq 22, which is sort of a pretty standard tool for professional artists. If you guys are using tablets, like an Intuos or a Huion or whatever, like it's all good. It's just a personal preference. I'm working on a canvas size that's around 5,000 pixels wide, as you can see in the top ruler here. In inches, that's 11 by 17. I like to work at this canvas size, just because like it sort of reflects the limitations that you'd have in real life when working on an 11 by 17 size of paper. If you limit your resolution be like as opposed to working on a canvas that's like 10,000 or 20,000 pixels wide, the resolution of the canvas sort of limits how detailed you can go. So that's really good for sort of staying zoomed out and looking at the overall drawing as you're working on it. And for the brushes I'll use, I just have a couple go-to brushes which will be available in the description below. But from this brush set here, I'll only use a couple. The first one I'll use is a sort of round, like a hard, 50% hardness round brush with a little bit of texture. So if I press really hard, you can see it's got a little bit of feathering on the edge here. So, but it's not, you know, as soft as just a straight, you know, soft brush like this. I will also be using a soft round brush every once in a while, very sparingly, just to soften some of the shapes. And if in the demo, if I draw hair or, you know, just other details, I might use the or sort of rectangle brush. This has a little bit of tilt shift on it, so you can see as I tilt my pen, the brush tilts as well. And this is just really good for control, changing the angle of your stroke. And I might also use this triangle brush, which just has a nice sort of flow to it, especially when doing hair and small details like sketching and stuff. So honestly, the brushes aren't really that important. As long as it's not fighting against you all the time. You don't want to use, for example, like a really hard full opacity brush especially when painting the human figure, because most of the forms are soft, and even if you have creases or edges, they're generally pretty soft compared to if you were to paint like a mechanical thing or like a box. So and that's just pretty that's applicable to all organics. If you're drawing creatures and vegetation and stuff like that, you want to stick to more soft forms. And even, you know, if I do want a hard edge or a sharp edge, I can always use this sort of 50% hardness brush at a smaller scale, like this size, and I can get a pretty hard edge in reference to what's around it. So yeah, if I want to sharpen up an edge, I can just scale my brush down and lay down a crease. Okay. So that's pretty much it for tools. Like I said, the tools you're using there's a lot of just preference and experimentation. So yeah, feel free to experiment, build your own library of brushes. That's what I did over time with mine. Brushes are really specific to every artist. There's all these factors like what the Wacom tablet properties are and what your pen properties are and all that stuff. So yeah, just experiment, and yeah, let's get into the worksheet. So this is in this part with these spheres, I'm gonna look at some basic painting techniques that will help you sculpt the figure in when you're tackling like a full painting. And this sort of worksheet is super useful even when you have a lot of experience under your belt. Going back to these simple exercises will really benefit your technique and your development, and keep refreshing your mind when it comes to remembering your fundamentals and really focusing on developing your control and your painting control. So, and then I also have a reference sheet. So right here with some reference. Forewarned, there's a little bit of nudity, nothing explicit, but yeah, I mean, it is a figure painting tutorial. So, so these are some amazing photographs by a photographer called Anton Belovodchenko. He's an amazing figure photographer. I've attached his Instagram profile and his website where you can see his gallery. I love these sort of black and white photographs of figures because they really show the form well, with a simple light source, either one or 2 point lights, and yeah, they offer a beautiful sort of range of poses and gestures that you can really work on, whether it be sort of deciphering the underlying anatomy or just learning how to paint with light and develop the forms that way. So I'll be referring to this throughout this workshop. In the demos, these will be the figures that I'll be painting, and in this sort of worksheet for each technique, I'll refer to these just to point out where the techniques are applicable. So let's hop into the worksheet. And the first thing to tackle is actually, I'm not going to go in a specific order here because I think looking at value is the most important thing when you're painting a figure. So I'm going to start off with value, even though there's all the other stuff. But okay, so when you're looking at values for a figure painting, there's a couple key principles that you really have to keep in mind, and that the value range that you choose is going to revolve around the local color of your skin or of the area that you're painting. So and also keep in mind that these spheres, I'm tackling them all as if they're like a skin, and not like a plastic or another material. So these are just like sort of skin spheres. So the local value of this sphere is around 50% gray, and if I just color pick, you can see that I'm not color picking from where the light is or where the dark is, where the shadow lies. I'm trying to pick somewhere in between, and you can see on my color wheel that it lies around 50% gray. What's really important is not to go for your lightest lights and your darkest darks. You don't want to go too far off that local value, because you don't want to have too high contrast, and it also becomes really, really difficult to control your value scheme when you have like a super wide span of values. So if I just pull up the sort of levels of this sphere, so Control L to pull up your levels, you can see that most of my grays are sort of in the 75-80% gray region. This is where the levels spike, and that's because there's all this shadow, and then most of, like the rest of the grays, they sort of peel off towards the 50%, which is my local value, and there's very, very little light gray, and it maxes out at around 25% gray, which is the highlight region. So you see I'm not getting anywhere close to black, and I'm not getting anywhere close to white, which is even more important, because if you go to white, it really blasts out your value scheme and sort of overexposes stuff, and it burns out your image very quickly. So you definitely want to stay away from that. And if your local color is darker or lighter than that, all the values around it will sort of shift with it, and you can sort of see that if I go, if I just shift the mid-gray value and it darkens the sphere or lightens it. Let's say I lighten it like this, and pull up the levels adjustment again, you can see that this whole sort of peak of gray has shifted towards the white. And that's really useful if you're drawing people with more fair skin or with darker skin. You want to make sure that your value scheme of this levels sort of shifts with your local color. And that sort of brings us as well to the value scheme of this sphere. So I'm just going to pull up a square brush to illustrate this. A really useful exercise that you can do is when you look up your references is to convert it to black and white by either adding a black color layer on top of it or just desaturating it. And then color picking from the different areas and figuring out exactly what those values are. So here we addressed already that the sort of mid-tone value is a 50% gray. Our brightest highlights are around 25% gray, so I'll lay that down here. Then we have our darkest, or the sort of darkest area that isn't completely occluded. So that would be the core shadow, the band of shadow that sort of spans this area here. And that sort of delineates the shadow area on any form. And that core shadow is going to be around 80% gray. So that's going to be, or like 75-80% gray in that region. Then our darkest darks, hands down, are going to be the darks that are like deeply occluded. If there's a crease, like a really deep crease or a deep fold, or just basically a crevice or an area that's really, really recessed, not a lot of light is going to get to it, and so even the shadows are going to be like occluded. And so this is the sort of dark rim that you see around the bottom where it sort of contacts the ground. And even then, like, it seems pretty dark, but it's only going around 80 or 85. It's just like one tone, one step darker. And then you can see there's a little bit of reflected light under here. And that reflected light is really important not to go too far above the shadow color value. So you have your core shadow value here. And the reflected light is just going to be, you can see as I color pick it, how this moves. But the reflected light is just going to be a touch above the core shadow value. And that's going to sort of lay in between your core shadow and your occluded area, at least on the sphere. So that's the value scheme of skin that I tend to stick around. Again, if the skin is darker or lighter, I'll sort of shift that over. So you can do that a couple different ways. And I'll just show you with some smaller spheres here. But if I wanted to go lighter, and you really have to do this a lot to sort of train your eye and see what works well and what doesn't, and what's too blown out and what's too dark or too contrasty. But I always start by trying to shift my local value directly. So this 50% slider here, I'll shift sort of closer to the black to lighten everything. It's sort of counterintuitive, but on the levels, just shift it in this direction to lighten it overall. And then if the occluded areas are getting too dark or the white areas are getting too bright, you can sort of compress it with the output levels on the bottom here. So you can sort of crunch the values that way, or if you want to make a more matte surface or a glossier surface, whatever, you can just play around with this level adjustments. But I'm going to crunch down these values just a little bit, just to keep those in check. So that would be a sort of lighter version. Might go even brighter. So this would be like really, really fair skin. And then if I wanted a darker skin tone, I start by shifting that mid-tone value to a darker overall color. And then the white balance here is still going to be quite bright. So I'm going to want to crunch that white down a little bit, and then the darks are getting super dark. So I want to bring this up just a tad. Something like that. You can see now that these are clearly different colors or values, but they still contain, you know, structure, and you can still read the form really nicely. And you can see even for the dark, you can see how compressed my values are. So even my brightest brights aren't going over 50%, and I'm still not touching black. Yeah, the key to developing a strong sense of form and is really just developing some subtlety in the way you paint values and the way you address values. It almost has nothing to do with color, actually. It's all in your black and white. If you were just to keep the black and white image, you can always see a black and white image perfectly. You can read everything in the image, but if you're only to keep the colors, you wouldn't be able to read everything. It would just be like a jumble of color. So yeah, so that's values. Okay, so now that we have that addressed, I just want to look at the reference again and talk about how you should sort of measure your values against your reference. Because when you're using photographic reference like this, in photography, you have what's called your dynamic range, which is how light the lights go and how dark the darks go. And sometimes you can have these like HDR, these high dynamic range photographs where the whites are really blown out and the blacks are really dark. So they just pump the contrast on them. And it's important to acknowledge it and to just to be aware that your reference is just that. It's just a reference. You don't have to copy it one for one. And just stick to the sort of theory, and you'll be fine. So if I color pick the values on this has a pretty good value scheme overall, but the darks do get pretty close to black, and the brightest brights, they do sort of jump up in certain areas where there are highlights. But you can see even the highlights, like if I select the sharp highlight on her shoulder blade, it's not really going above that 20% area. But you can see in the hair it goes quite dark, and in the occluded areas it's getting pretty close to black. But that's fine because the hair is darker. But so this is why I'm using these photographs. They have a pretty nice value scheme, but sometimes you'll see photographs that are sort of cranked up. This, which can be fine. Like it can have a nice artistic effect and stuff. But the same way you wouldn't use like an Instagram photo with a really heavy filter on it. You don't want to use any sort of photography with super heavy filters on it, because you see this is totally black now, and this is like again getting really close to white. So this is what you'd call a really burned area, and this is a really like blown out highlight. So you can see here because what happens in these areas is that you get all these sort of shapes here. They sort of melt into one, and you can't really read what the form is. Like here you can still sort of see it, but if you compare it to what we had before, you can still see some more subtlety in the value. And you can see here now that you know, this area has a highlight here, and that it divides. There's, you know, there's layers to the value. It doesn't all just like melt into one shape. Although when you are blocking out the light scheme, it is good to look at those bigger shapes. But once you start getting into resolving the anatomy and the surface detail, it's nice to look at those secondary light shapes and the secondary shadow shapes. Okay. Okay. So the first painting technique that we're going to look at is really going to be the bread and butter of painting and sculpting the form with light, and that's what I call the pinch and poke method, where you're sort of drawing the shape out in one direction or pushing it in. And to practice this on a sphere is much more useful than practicing it on a flat plane, because on a sphere you have, you know, a range of values, and you also have a light that's directional, where on a plane you have one shade of gray and you can't really see like which direction the light's coming from. So the idea of the pinch and poke is that as you're painting, and I'll start by just giving an example of this, and then I'll go into explaining. But the idea is to color pick around the area that you want to pinch or poke, to create a sort of dip in the form. So you can see that's what's happening here. And this sort of poke here, you can see a lot in the form if you look at the crevices that are created. You know, in this sort of areas, you can see a pinch here on the bony landmark, a poke here, anywhere in the ribs here. Like all these areas where the flesh sort of recedes, or, you know, concave and convex areas are where you would use this method. And so starting with the poke, the idea is that you have your local color that you want to sort of push in, and because if you think of the surface as being like a straight line like this, you're trying to create this, right, where it's pushing in. Or if you have your curved surface like this, you're trying to create a divot like that. And so scientifically, what you call like the normals of the faces, they're pointing, you know, perpendicular to the tangent of the surface. So this face is painting up, so you'd want to color pick the same color as this face over here, which is pointing in the same direction. And this face, which is pointing almost straight horizontally, you'll want to color pick from below, where it's also pointing straight horizontally. So I'm just going to color code these. You can see what I mean. So on the form, if I'm looking at this area here, right, I'm going to want to color pick above it to make this sort of bottom face. This. And I'm going to want to blend that out so that it's a soft transition, like you would see here. And then I'd color pick below to like an equivalent, it would be this color here, but just a darker value. And I want to lay that on top, keeping the sharpest edge like right where they meet, and then slowly blend that out. And this really develops your control on of laying down, of like how much pressure you're putting on the pen, because obviously you want to put more pressure where there's more contrast, and then you want to slowly fade it out. And if you want to recess it even more into the surface, you just have to lower or heighten the contrast. So you want to darken the darks and you want to brighten the brights. And I'm not even looking at creating a cast shadow yet. I'm just looking at the forms. But that'll sort of push it even deeper. And if you go really deep, then you want to add some sort of cast shadow to show that it's not just like yeah, so that it's not just like a form shadow. And that's basically how you'd create like a belly button or a divot in the skin, dimples, whatever. And so the opposite, which would be sort of pinch, is you'd select the top color for the top facing surface and blend that out, and then a darker value for the bottom. And you create a sort of pinch like this. So this would be like a bump, and you can always adjust the sharpness, and that's really important to consider if it's a soft bump or if it's a really sharp ridge, which we'll look at in the next example. But you can soften it just by sort of increasing your brush size and blending out so that the where the light and the dark meet, it's much softer. So that would be sort of a soft bump like you'd see in a lot of bony landmarks, like the collarbone, or in the hip area, and then the same for the pokes. You just soften out that transition in the center. Well, you still keep, you're dark on top and you still keep the light on the bottom, right? You're just making a sort of softer dip. So that instead of it being, a really sharp poke like that, it's more of a soft bend. Okay. Now expanding on. Actually, I'll keep this just in case. So expanding on the pinch and poke would be the crease and the ridge, which is basically a drawn out, or like if you were to repeat it multiple times, it's just a drawn out poke or a drawn out pinch. If you've ever used a sculpting program like ZBrush, it would be like a damn standard brush where you're sort of drawing a ridge or a poke. And a lot of these methods are pulled from sculpting, because that's essentially what you're doing, right? You're drawing out the form, you're pushing the form, you're moving it around. So with a poke, you're going to want to go above your local value again to create a crease, and you're going to want to draw that along whichever line you want to create a crease. Now, it's important to know that you need to respect the sort of location of that crease in terms of value. So here I'm in a lighter region of the sphere, so I'm going to want to select above and below that region for whichever values go down here. But here, I'm going to want to respect, because it's in a darker region, I'm going to want to go above and below this area. So in this top area here, I'll go lighter with whatever that top face of the surface is, but I'll fade it out, and this will still stay darker than this, right? Because this only has to go as light as this color picked area here. And then I'll slowly blend these out. And a note on blending, I think for painting, especially painting digitally, to learn to control your brush pressure, and to blend with brush strokes rather than erasing or smudging with like the smudge tool. I mean, you can do it whatever way you want. Like I don't. It's preference, but controlling your brush is really important in developing your painting skill, and it's also just faster. Like if you develop your control with your brush, you know right away that you just need to lay down a softer stroke, and you don't have to go back and fix your marks every time you put it down. So just be aware of that. When you're doing these exercises, a lot of it is just about focusing on mark making. In here, see, it's all in subtlety. You know, I'm not laying down like a really thick mark like that. I'm just going down and slowly building it up. I want to sharpen it in some areas. Here maybe I'll have a little more contrast. And again, I'm thinking of this as being skin, so everything comes and goes with a softness. It's like one continuous piece of fabric. So you don't want to end, you know, really abruptly, just like that. You want to end everything with a softness. So this would be a crease, and the ridge would sort of be the opposite. So I'm laying down sort of an indication of where I want that to be. Blend out this top face. And a bit of a highlight, make it protrude out a little bit more, and then I want to draw in some darker value here. Just like that. So you can see it's basically just a drawn out version of the pinch and poke, and the same sort of theory is applied to both. And you really see these areas in well, you see a lot of creases where two muscle groups will sort of overlap. So you can see them. I'll just mark creases, so you can see creases here, you know, the quadricep, where these sort of marks happen between the bicep and the tricep, and forms muscles, and the calves. So these are all the types of creases that that you see. And then the ridges are really useful to show bony landmarks and just protrusions. So you can see ridges, the rib cage, a really prominent one, in the scapula. Here's another crease in the spinal, where the spine flows down, and in between the back muscles, like the lats here. Now the creases don't have to be straight. Sometimes they zigzag. Sometimes they're really soft, like here in between the muscles in the hip. You can see this is a very soft crease in between the hamstring and the top of your quad. And then you see some sharper creases where limbs will meet the body, so in the armpit, like here. So yeah, these are, and obviously where there's overlaps, like and stuff starts to fold, you'll see some really prominent creases happening. You can barely see, there's a really couple small ones here. So when skin, in the areas where there's a low amount of like subdermal fat and skin gets pretty dry, if there's any movement in the skin will stretch and it will fold, and you'll see a lot of little creases and dips and stuff that create some really elegant surface detail. That I find super fun to paint. I think it's well, in my opinion, I like to really paint that. I think it's really fun. And I think those little things add so much to the realism of the figure that you're painting. Like if this figure was just, if there was none of this, if this was just like, you know, blended out, and this was just a sort of soft mess, you know, it sort of flattens everything, you know, when everything is really soft, it kind of creates this this formless blob. But having those little creases and that little bit of structure really really provides structure. It makes it feel like a human with a skeleton, rather than just a blob of skin. Okay, so those are creases and ridges. As I mentioned, folds are basically a series of creases, and folds, you can also apply this to any fabric that you're painting, but what you want to really concentrate on when you're creating folds is the sort of direction of the force that is implied, like that is pushing on whatever part of the body that's creating a fold. So folds are generally created by compression. So if you think of like an area where if you have a rib cage and this sort of spine is tilting, and you have the pelvis here. So in this area here, where there's compression happening in between the pelvis and the rib cage, you'll get folds happening in the skin, right? So here there's compression happening, and then you get folds like this, where you wouldn't have any folds on this far side. Or if you know, when you get to the end of a leg, and you have your knee here, right? You're gonna have a fold here in between the calf and the leg, so you'll get some folds. And depending how loose the skin is, or if there's fat in that area, you might get more or less folds. But or if you have cellulite or something, you have folds in areas of compression. And then you might also have areas or folds that happen in skin that sort of stretches, but they'll be sort of parallel to the force. So if you think of something stretching here and the force is up here, you get sort of compression happening in this area. So you might have folds that happen sort of parallel to the stretching force here. And this you can see sometimes in if somebody has their arm extended up. I don't know if you can, I'm trying to think. I mean, you can see folds happening in the creases, in most of the creases. So here, of course here, that area, small folds there, and of course compression happening here, etc. Now these figures aren't really stressed out or stretched out. Yeah, they're not stressed out either, but if a figure's like really stretched out, sometimes you'll see like sort of stretch folds happening. So this is a little difficult to illustrate on a sphere, because a sphere is all convex and folds normally happen in concave areas. But I'll sort of illustrate it as if you were sort of pulling on the skin and sort of dragging skin, and it was wrinkling over. So my fold basically will go do something like this. So I'm going to stay within the value range of this area and just start slowly marking in. And the thing with this exercise is I'm not drawing in, like I'm not delineating where those folds will be. I'm painting, I'm focusing on painting, right? I'm painting with light. So I'm adding light in areas that I want to be turned towards the light, and I'm adding more dark tones where I want it to recess, or I want it to tilt down. I'm going to want a sharp crease. Happens under here. And sort of blend this top face in. That'll be my sort of first line. So it's a mix of a sort of ridge and a crease, because I have a crease that's happening under. And then another layer. Let's do a third. Something like this. Now, one thing about, like, I don't really like, this is a pretty boring shape. It's like a boring curve. So if I want to imply that there's more force happening, I like to just select the area and either warp it around or liquefy it with the filter liquefy. Let's say I drag it out like this. And I have a little bit more of a sense of force coming down. And here you can see I didn't blend out that edge there, so it starts really abruptly, and that sort of it ruins the illusion of the continuous surface. So I'm just going to take my time, blend out those transitions. So now you can see my folds sort of start gradually, and they fade out towards the end. They have a sort of peak section in the center where there's a lot of contrast, and then they sort of fizzle out. Again, this would be like you're dragging the surface of the skin with like your finger or something. But normally a fold would happen, and I'll just do a quick edit on the sphere. So actually, I'll liquefy this, cancel because my transparency is on. If I just change the form of this so that there's a concave area, I can illustrate this a little better. So here I would think of the folds being caused by this compression here. Oops. You also, I guess you can also show this in the profile a little bit. You can hear there might be some rumpling happening. Darker value for the bottom, and then value for the top. So you can see how that compression, the illusion of compression is happening. Now I have to fix the value of this area because it's supposed to be facing the top overall. It sort of looks like a weird fetus creature, but whatever. And you can see this series of creases happening, and where these really become tight creases, you're going to want to just push the contrast just a little bit. And then, of course, because they're going around the edge, I'm just going to want to adjust that silhouette to reflect that just slightly, so you can see how that illusion is created. Just gonna soften all of this out just a little bit. So there. It's like grub. So those are folds. Now the last sort of surface, the last sort of details that I'm going to look at are veins. And veins are really, really subtle, but they do add a lot to the structure, the sort of like tertiary detail structure of the skin. So, I mean, you can totally leave them out when you're doing figure painting, but especially if you're drawing very thin or very muscular, like low body fat bodybuilders or something like that. And when you draw hands, feet, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Hands and feet, where the skin is really thin, and there's very like little fat. I mean, even in people that have a lot of body fat, their hands and their feet will generally be a lot more defined. Like just because naturally the fat doesn't build up in your hands and feet as much. So veins is really about subtlety, and it's about how they read from far away, not how defined they all are. So it's just about implying that there's something under the skin, and not about, again, it's not about delineating like where the veins are happening. So we're not going to draw, we're not trying to draw the sort of outlines like this. If you have we're not drawing the outlines of the veins. We're just implying that there's something sort of lifting the surface of the skin. And this will be a very soft, subtle sort of stream of ridges. So I'm going to start with a lighter color, and really, you can turn your flow down. I forgot to mention this, but when I'm painting skin, if my flow's all the way up, it becomes quite difficult to control my pen pressure, because these brushes are made so that you don't have to press really hard to put down 100% opacity. So I turn my flow down to 30-40%, so that it makes it easier to lay down sort of transparent layers of paint or value. So I'm gonna select a lighter color and sort of sketch in very, very softly. You can barely see it actually on but just where I want the veins to sort of run through. And maybe there will be one that branches off over here, and one that's under here. Sometimes they sort of reconnect, sometimes they sort of curl. So something like this. And I'll erase a little bit of that away, even though it's already super subtle. And so this is the lighter color, right? And for the darker color, I'm just gonna lay it right underneath as a really soft sort of shadow. Where they branch, you can, sometimes where veins branch, they can have a little bump, sort of like trees. So you can sort of accentuate that transition, give it a little bit of structure. But I'm gonna lay just a touch of dark value on the underside, making sure that all those transitions are soft, except for the sort of top of the ridge. This is way too strong. And again, they come and go with softness. So you don't want to end a vein abruptly, just like this. You don't just want to start it and end it. Like it just stopped. Veins generally they'll start from like deeper in the muscle, and then they'll sort of like climb to the surface of the skin, and then they'll sort of disappear back into the muscle, just because that's how veins circulate the blood to everywhere. And you can see now that with and without, it's very subtle, but it's just a little bit of detail that's more readable from far. Like it's just a little bit of subtlety. Now keep in mind that this amount of subtlety in your values, if you don't put, if the base value underneath isn't really clean, for instance, how can I mess this up? So if you have like a whole bunch of like different splotches of stuff, like if your surface is really like sort of noisy, even if it's like soft and noisy like this, it'll be a lot harder to give to have those show up, because you already have a lot of contrast in your surface. So adding that other layer, like it disappears. It just looks like more noise. So when you have a nice base, it's easy to build up the tertiary detail, or the secondary and tertiary details on top of that clean surface. Yeah. And that's pretty much it for the surface details. That's weird. I don't want this anymore. I'll just stick with the grub. And we already went over values, so let's talk about color. So when I paint figures, I really concentrate on values first. I'm not at the stage in my art development where I can just lay down color with a perfect value at the same time, and like I know my strengths and weaknesses, so I'm still focusing on value because there's so much to master in that. And color is easy to add especially when you're working digitally, there's ways of working non-destructively so that you can have really vibrant colors and not destroy your value scheme. So this is what I'm going to demonstrate with my last sphere, and sort of talk about the properties of skin and how when skin interacts with light, it creates different shades and different amounts of saturation and hues. Now, I really love color, and that's another reason I also treat it independently of my values, is because I love to play with all the playfulness of warm and cool colors and stuff like how subsurface scattering changes the saturation of the skin, and how the Fresnel effect around the edges, like how it'll reflect the environment, and showing like the different hues of the veins showing underneath, all the subtlety and stuff in color. So doing this method will really help with that. So the first thing when I'm colorizing a black and white image is I want to take all the gray out. So I do that by first I duplicate it. I duplicate the layer, so I'll duplicate the sphere here, so that I don't mess up my value structure at all. I set the layer to color. So the color, like if you set it to any other blending mode, color dodge, overlay, hard light, whatever, it'll always change your values, and you can just see that by scrolling through. Everything is changing the way the sphere looks, except for color. If I turn that layer on and off, it's not changing anything. And then what I'll do on this top layer here, I'll create a clipping mask in my layer so that it only affects what's happening on the sphere below it. And then I'll pull up my color balance with Control B, and this will basically give me I'm on luminosity, that's why. This will basically just give a hue to my entire sphere. So you can go with any hue, but this this first layer here is going to be my sort of undertone colors, and I really take my coloring technique from a traditional oil technique or a traditional painting technique, which is glazing. So you set a basic color on the bottom, and then over top you add all the overtones of and color variation. So you can add warm colors or cool colors, but it's all about the playfulness between those two layers, the layers of overtones that you'll paint above, and this undertone layer. So when I start off, I always start with a cool undertone, just to give I find it gives the skin some depth, and sort of creates the illusion of translucency and depth in the layers of skin. So I always set it to like a pretty saturated, but not like crazy like digital saturation, just a subtle saturation of sort of blue or purple, or like this range of color. And the nice thing is it's non-destructive. So even though I colorized it, I just turn this layer on and off, and I go back to my black and white. And on top of this, I'll create another clipping mask and set this layer again to color. And on this layer, I'll be laying down my glazes of warm colors, of warmer colors. So I'm gonna take my texture brush again, and yeah, just so far I've only used this round texture brush. I haven't touched anything else. So so the first thing to talk about when you think of, or when I think of color, is the property that because skin is translucent, you have what's called either light transfer or subsurface scattering of the light under the skin. So as light like penetrates the skin, it'll sort of scatter, sort of like you would see in like a wax candle, or if you put a light behind like a piece of paper, like the light will sort of diffuse under the skin. And because of the sort of color of skin and the blood and stuff and all the layers, it sort of scatters into this saturated red orange color, and that happens around the edges of the skin where the light is sort of grazing the surface. So if you think of light, think like light hits the surface of the skin, and where it hits really shallowly, like here, it will sort of penetrate the surface of the skin and it'll scatter through it. So it'll go right through it, and it'll create a really sort of saturated area right here where it scatters through. And so you can see this, you see this effect evidently around the edges, where skin is very thin. And so like if you shine a light behind someone's ear, or if you've ever shone a light, like a flashlight through the palm of your hand, sometimes you'll see like really red areas pop up between your fingers. And it'll also show up pretty prominently in the transition from light to dark. So right around your core shadow, you'll get a little boost in saturation towards red. And that, I think, adds a lot of vibrancy to the skin, and you know, brings it a step further than just like beiges, right? You have a little bump in saturation. So on this color layer here, I'm going to pick a sort of saturated red color, and I'm just going to lay in a little bit of the color, a little bit of saturation around. Now, the nice thing about this technique too is you can be pretty dirty with the way you lay down colors. Like, you don't have to pay too much attention. But you can see that I don't want to lay it down super opaque, because I still want that inner play between the top layer and the bottom layer. So you can see if I turn my my undertone layer off, you can see it disappear, and the same for my top layer. Now, once I have my reds, I sort of lay them around the edge and mostly through the core shadow. That'll keep some cooler tones in my shadows, and it'll also keep some cooler tones in my highlight, where it would reflect maybe some of the skylight. Now I'm sort of on my color wheel, I'm just going to creep up slowly but surely with every glaze. I'm going to creep up until I basically go back to blue, but I won't really go through greens that much, because with the yellows, orange and yellows, if you sort of go really desaturated, it almost gives the illusion of green against all the reds. It just, this is what I mean by, like, I'm not going to touch on certain subjects, like color theory. I'm just going to graze over them really quickly, but basically colors are relative to each other. So if you lay down a really saturated color beside a bunch of red, it'll sort of give the illusion of the complementary color. So, and it's the same if you lay down just a desaturated version of red against the red, it'll be cooler. So, so I'm just going to creep up my color wheel, and I'm going to select this sort of beige color next. And this is sort of going to be my the color of the skin that I'm looking for. So, I mean, skins are all sorts of different shades. They go more yellow. They go more green sometimes, like more olive. Sometimes they're a little cooler, and they have a lot of pinks and purples in them. It really depends on what kind of skin tone you're just searching to give your figure. And yeah, so I'm glazing that on, making sure to still keep some interplay between the top and bottom. And you can see as I put more and more glazes, my undertone becomes more subtle, but it's still there. And the nice thing is that at this stage, because they're two different layers, I can change the undertone and see how it affects the overall shade of skin that I'm or the overall color of the skin that I'm created. So if I just pull up my hue saturation by pressing Control H, or sorry, Control U, I can change the hue from being blue to, changing it to purple, to red, to yellow, or to green. So you can see how this is sort of changing the undertone of my sphere. And this can create all sorts of really interesting effects if you want to create, like, make a warmer tone of skin or a cooler tone of skin, etc. So play around with that. I love to just experiment and change a whole bunch of the properties of the skin as I'm going along, and see what fits the image the best. And yeah, that's just one of the advantages of working this way. And the same thing goes for the top layer. If this is a little too red, I can go into my color balance, and I can sort of desaturate it by adding, so in my reds, I want to pull it the opposite directions toward the cyan, so I can desaturate the red a little bit. If I want to add more yellow, I can bring in a little more yellow. So it just gives you a lot of control over your tone. So I'm going to stick with something like, bring a little more yellow in here. And finally, I'm going to go just a tad more yellow, and I'm going to start glazing just around this sort of color. Yeah, make sure any new layer you create above this is always on color, so that you're not ruining your values. And maybe just a little touch more saturation right here. And I can merge all these down if I want, once I'm happy or satisfied with the result. If you want more undertone showing through, you can also lower the opacity of the top layer, or take away from the bottom layer as well. But yeah, so that's basically the idea behind skin and how to colorize it. You can always go, skin, there's no one shade of skin. The overall color of skin is really going to depend on the environment that the figure is in. So if they're just in a gray box with a white light source, then yeah, you'll get beige and reds and greens. But if you see a figure that's laying in like a field of grass, for instance, all the reflected green light is gonna show on the surface of the skin. So all the reflected light will have this green tone. Or if the light source color changes, if it's like a pink light or a purple light, you will only see pink or purple. Because the light source, like white light, has all the colors in it. It has all the colors ranging, so you'll see all the colors. But if you have like a red light, you'll only see red. You won't see any green or blue showing through your figure, because there's none of that spectrum is showing in the source of light. And that wraps up part 1 of this workshop. So feel free to download this Photoshop work file. I'll attach a link in the description below to a Google Drive or a Dropbox or something with this PSD, so that you can go through this exercise. Never hurts whether you're new to painting or you're a long-time professional. It's always nice to go back to these simple exercises and really focus on your craft. And hopefully you guys learned something valuable. And in part 2, we'll be doing a sort of a real-time demo. So same pace as this. I'll be trying to talk over as I'm painting, and who knows if it'll be an hour long or 3 or 4 hours long, but I'll try to work at a decent pace. But I don't want to hide anything or create a time lapse that'll just jump over a whole bunch of stuff. It'll just be a real-time feed of me painting, and yeah, and as there's interesting things that come up, we'll talk about them and discuss them. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section. And yeah, you can also message me, follow me on Instagram, and if you have any questions, you can also contact me there. I always look through my messages. And yeah, so see you in part 2, and thanks for dropping by. Ciao.